The historical examination of Christian martyrdom outside the writings of the New Testament begins with a clear boundary dictated by surviving sources. Before the year 64 AD, no Roman historian, provincial governor, administrative record, inscription, or external observer documents the execution of individuals identified as Christians. This absence is not a minor gap. It shapes the entire framework for understanding the earliest phase of Christian interaction with imperial authority. The surviving record draws a firm line. Before Nero's actions in Rome, there is no traceable evidence of state-directed punishment, legal proceedings, or targeted violence against the Christian movement documented by non-Christian, contemporary writers. The historical landscape of the early 1st century is well mapped in Roman administrative history. The Julio-Claudian period produced an extensive body of surviving material: letters, senatorial records referenced by later historians, legal texts, military accounts, and civic inscriptions. These documents illuminate imperial policy and provincial governance with considerable detail. When scrutinizing this material, one finds no reference to a distinct religious group identified as Christians or a movement marked for surveillance or punishment. The administrative silence is total, indicating either that the group was too small to register within official documentation or that Roman authorities did not perceive it as distinct from Judaism at this early stage. Roman administrative practice tracked groups that posed potential instability. New cults, foreign rites, or associations that appeared capable of undermining civic order were noted when they appeared. This is reflected in the scrutiny directed towards certain mystery religions, voluntary associations, and foreign cultic practices throughout the 1st century. In these records, observant administrators paid attention to activities that threatened military discipline, disrupted local economies, or encouraged refusal to participate in civic religious obligations. Yet in this sphere, Christians remain unmentioned before the mid-60s. The absence suggests no identifiable conflict between early Christian communities and Roman authority during these decades. The administrative machinery that monitored potential sectarian disturbances left no indication that Christians were recognized as a separate category. The writings of contemporary Roman historians reinforce this silence. Authors, including Seneca the Younger, who commented extensively on Roman society during the reign of Claudius and the early years of Nero, do not indicate awareness of a Christian population. Seneca's surviving works examine moral behavior, political conduct, and the social challenges of his era, but include no mention of Christians, persecution, or sectarian criminalization. His silence aligns with the administrative record. Before 64 AD, the Christian presence made no measurable impact on Roman literary or political consciousness. In Judea, where Christianity originated, the record is clearer in one sense and silent in another. Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, born in 37 AD, frequently documented sectarian tensions, uprisings, and movements that captured Roman attention. His writings provide detailed descriptions of political unrest, messianic claimants, and groups that shaped Judean society under Roman rule. Within this context, Josephus mentions figures connected to early Christianity, including James, brother of Jesus, whose death Josephus attributes to the actions of the high priest Ananus. This event, occurring around 62 AD, does not describe Roman involvement, official sanction, or execution under imperial authority. It reflects internal Judean judicial dynamics rather than imperial action against Christians. Because the event does not involve Roman legal procedure targeting Christians, it falls outside the scope of externally documented Christian martyrdom as defined by the historical criteria governing this timeline. This distinction is critical. Internal disputes, intra-Jewish legal proceedings, or incidents involving local authorities acting without Roman mandate do not fit the definition of Christian martyrdom recorded outside the Bible, used in rigorous historical analysis. The focus is on Roman state actions or provincially administered executions documented by external writers. Events mediated solely through Christian texts or internal community accounts remain outside this category unless corroborated by external sources. Before 64 AD, such corroboration did not exist. Roman administrative communication from the early 1st century further emphasizes the absence of Christian-related legal concerns. Surviving provincial correspondence, military records, and civic decrees show no evidence that Christians were identified, interrogated, or punished. When provincial governors reported disturbances or religious disputes, they did so in detail, as seen in records concerning the cult of Isis, Druidic practices, and disruptive associations. Governors relayed issues that might require clarification from the emperor, particularly regarding novel or politically sensitive movements. No such correspondence references Christians before Pliny the Younger's letters in 112 AD, which represent the earliest preserved Roman administrative inquiry into Christian practice. That absence before 64 AD reinforces that Christians did not appear within the observation of Roman governance. In addition to literary and administrative sources, epigraphy, inscriptions carved in stone, provides another independent dataset. Roman inscriptions record legal rulings, punishments, civic honors, and public works. Inscriptions also frequently commemorate individuals harmed or executed for crimes against the state. A systematic review of inscriptions dating to the early 1st century reveals no reference to Christians, executions for Christian practice, or punitive measures against a group by that designation. The inscriptions document various criminal categories, including treason, sacrilege, evasion of civic obligations, and sedition. Christians appear in none. The epigraphic silence is consistent with the broader documentary landscape. The lack of external evidence before 64 AD does not imply that early Christian communities experienced no hardship or internal conflict. It indicates that if such events occurred, they were not observed, recorded, or deemed significant by Roman or non-Christian chroniclers. Historical methodology requires that conclusions about externally documented martyrdom be based on sources that meet evidentiary standards. The absence of such sources for the pre-64 period imposes a firm historical constraint. This evidentiary boundary serves an important function. It prevents the retrospective projection of later patterns of persecution onto a period where they cannot be verified. Later Christian writings sometimes describe earlier suffering or conflict, but these accounts exist within a community's internal literary tradition. Without external corroboration, they cannot be treated as documented martyrdoms in the same sense as the events that began in 64 AD. Establishing this boundary maintains historical precision and preserves the integrity of the timeline. The timeline of Christian martyrdom documented outside the New Testament, therefore, begins only when the external record becomes clear and specific. That moment was reached in 64 AD with the actions taken in Rome during Nero's reign. The fire that devastated the city provided the catalyst for the first identifiable Roman engagement with the Christian population. Tacitus's record of these events provides explicit details: arrests, interrogations, executions, and the designation of the group under the name Christians. This is the earliest non-Christian source to identify Christians as a persecuted group and to present the Roman state as the active agent in their punishment. Before this point, Christian communities existed in various regions of the empire, but their interactions with civic and imperial authority left no trace accessible to historians outside Christian textual traditions. The absence is not a weakness in the record, it is a defining feature of it. This clarity allows the historical narrative to proceed with precision, beginning at the first externally documented moment when Christians appear within Roman punitive action. In July of 64 AD, Rome experienced a conflagration of unprecedented scale, consuming large sections of the city over a period of 6 days. Tacitus, in his Annals, Book 15, Chapter 38, provides the primary historical account of both the fire and the subsequent legal measures enacted by Emperor Nero. Tacitus notes the geographic scope of the fire, extending from the Palatine to the Subura, including both residential and commercial districts. Tacitus specifies that in the aftermath, Nero instituted emergency measures to rebuild the city, yet the fire became a political instrument in his administration of justice. Within this context, Tacitus records the first externally attested persecution of Christians. The historical framework situates these events immediately following the fire. The Roman Senate and populace, in search of those responsible, directed attention to a small identifiable sect known as Christians, adherents of a Judeo-Christian religious movement that had originated in Judea and had become present within Rome by the mid-1st century. Tacitus explicitly distinguishes Christians as a distinct group, separate from Judaism, noting their distinctive practices and the perceived societal danger. Nero initiated a punitive response to the population, formally accusing Christians of arson, although Tacitus observes that the guilt of the accused was likely tenuous. The executions that followed were public and intended as a spectacle. Tacitus provides detailed accounts of the methods employed. Individuals were subjected to scourging, burning, and crucifixion. Some were exposed to wild animals within the Circus Maximus and other public arenas. Tacitus emphasizes that the punishments were imposed for the criminal accusation of incendiarism and for adherence to the Christian sect, which the authorities considered a new and harmful superstition, superstitio nova. The Roman authorities undertook the process with administrative oversight. Arrests were made by the urban cohort under the authority of the prefect of the city. Those apprehended were brought before the urban prefect for preliminary examination. Records indicate that interrogations adhered to Roman criminal procedure, with questioning under torture employed in cases where denial of association with Christianity persisted. The use of torture aligns with Roman jurisprudence, which permitted coercive methods to extract confessions or clarify involvement in alleged crimes. The executions were staged in accordance with Roman public ritual and civic order. Tacitus describes Christians being clothed in garments soaked in combustible material and ignited, a method designed to serve both punitive and deterrent purposes. Crucifixions occurred along major thoroughfares, visible to the populace, and were accompanied by public warnings. Exposure to wild animals was carried out in amphitheaters, with animals procured through the established supply networks maintained for venations. The public dimension of these punishments reflects the Roman intent to affirm imperial authority and demonstrate the consequences of violating civic and religious expectations. The historical sources for this period are limited but corroborated through the works of Roman historians and administrative records. Tacitus, as a senator and historian writing in the early 2nd century, relied upon both official records and eyewitness accounts within the senatorial class. His documentation does not rely on Christian sources and thus constitutes external verification of the events. The account specifies that the victims were Christians and that their punishment followed the Great Fire, establishing a chronological anchor for subsequent events in the historical record of Christian martyrdom. The impact of these executions on the broader Christian community within Rome is not recorded in secular sources. Tacitus does not provide information on numbers, identities, or social background beyond noting the general identification of victims as adherents of Christianity. The precision of the method, including burning, crucifixion, and exposure to wild beasts, aligns with known Roman punitive practices for capital crimes and religious transgressions perceived to threaten public order. Further corroboration emerges from later Roman writers who reference Nero's actions indirectly. Suetonius, in his Life of Nero, chapter 16, notes that Nero inflicted punishments upon Christians, labeling them as followers of Christus, which has been historically interpreted as a reference to Christus or the Christian founder. While Suetonius provides less procedural detail than Tacitus, the alignment of both sources confirms the occurrence of executions under Nero following the fire of 64 AD. Archaeological evidence from the period, while not directly linked to named victims, supports the presence of urban areas designated for public executions. Excavations in the Ager Vaticanus and the Campus Martius reveal the existence of crucifixion sites, execution grounds, and spaces used for animal shows, consistent with the methods described in Tacitus. These findings provide spatial context for the recorded events. The significance of 64 AD within the historical timeline of Christian martyrdom lies in the convergence of political, social, and religious factors. The fire of Rome created an exigency for the imperial administration to identify scapegoats. The Christians, as a discrete religious minority, became the target. Tacitus's account documents the intersection of state authority, criminal procedure, and religious identity, establishing the first verifiable instance of Christian martyrdom recorded outside scriptural contexts. From a chronological standpoint, the events of 64 AD serve as the baseline for subsequent martyrdoms. The procedural details provided by Tacitus illustrate the Roman legal framework applied to Christians, including arrest, interrogation, punishment, and public display. The recorded executions form a precedent for the legal treatment of Christians in the early 2nd century under emperors such as Trajan, marking the institutionalization of punitive responses to the Christian sect within Roman governance. The historiography of this period emphasizes the distinction between Christian writings and secular Roman records. Before 64 AD, martyrdoms described in Christian texts lack external verification. The Nero persecutions, by contrast, are documented by an independent Roman historian, allowing for the construction of a historically verifiable sequence. This evidentiary shift defines the beginning of the externally corroborated timeline of Christian martyrdom. Following the documented executions of Christians in Rome in 64 AD under Emperor Nero, the historical record enters a period with no externally verified accounts of Christian martyrdom. This interval, extending from the immediate aftermath of Nero's punitive measures through the first decade of the 2nd century, is characterized by a conspicuous absence of mention in Roman administrative records, non-Christian literature, and provincial correspondence. Surviving sources from this period provide evidence of Roman governance, provincial management, and legal codification, yet they do not register additional executions of Christians outside anecdotal Christian narratives. The historical significance of this period lies in its evidentiary silence, which establishes a gap in the externally attested timeline of martyrdom. Tacitus' Annals, completed circa 116 AD, remain the principal source for Nero's persecution and do not extend to provide accounts of subsequent executions. Suetonius' Life of Nero also remains silent on any further punitive action directed at Christians following the 64 AD incident. The absence of additional Roman record entries concerning Christian executions indicates that no state-sanctioned, publicly documented martyrdoms occurred within the documented provinces during this interval. Roman administrative correspondence, including letters preserved from provincial governors to the Senate or emperor and legal edicts codified during the reigns of emperors such as Galba, Otho Vitellius, and Vespasian, show standard application of Roman criminal law without reference to Christian-specific prosecutions. During this period, Roman legal codes allowed for prosecutions based on general criminal acts, sacrilege, or subversive activities, yet there is no surviving evidence that Christians were subject to these procedures in a manner that resulted in execution and was recorded externally. Provincial governors, such as those documented in epistolary collections and surviving legal decisions, executed administrative and judicial duties in accordance with imperial directives, including the maintenance of civic order and taxation, but their records do not include cases that can be linked to Christian adherence. The lack of recorded prosecutions is particularly notable in the senatorial and equestrian correspondence, which frequently documented trials of citizens and notable provincial figures. The absence of references to Christians indicates either a lack of state-initiated execution or, if local disputes occurred, that such events were not officially recorded in surviving documents. Secondary Roman historians, including Cassius Dio and Suetonius, provide chronological narratives of imperial reigns covering the period between 64 and 107 AD. Their accounts include descriptions of political instability, military campaigns, and civic events, yet they remain silent on Christian martyrdoms, reinforcing the conclusion drawn from provincial records and official correspondence. The convergence of silence across multiple independent sources confirms that no verifiable martyrdoms outside Christian writings can be documented during this interval. This silence is integral to establishing the historical timeline, demarcating a clear boundary between the Nero persecutions and subsequent executions recorded in the early 2nd century. Christian sources of the period, including letters and martyrologies compiled in later centuries, reference individuals purportedly executed during these decades. But the absence of external corroboration renders these accounts historically unverified. These sources cannot be relied upon to extend the verified chronology beyond 64 AD, and their narratives are excluded from a strictly historical record. The legal framework in Rome during these decades continued to operate under established principles. Roman jurisprudence mandated adherence to procedure for capital cases, including interrogation, testimony, and examination by magistrates. The lack of recorded cases involving Christians suggests that they were either not brought to trial under capital statutes, or that any trials conducted did not result in executions significant enough to enter the official record. This reflects the broader pattern of sporadic enforcement against religious groups prior to systematic policies documented in the early 2nd century. Regional records, including inscriptions, municipal decrees, and civic edicts, provide additional context for governance in provinces such as Asia Minor, Syria, and the Italian peninsula. These inscriptions detail civic appointments, tax assessments, and legal proceedings, yet they omit any mention of Christian prosecutions or executions. The continuity of administrative documentation across regions further supports the conclusion of an absence of verifiable martyrdoms during the silent decades. Archaeological evidence, including amphitheaters, execution sites, and municipal buildings, does not yield inscriptions or artifacts indicating executions of Christians within this interval, reinforcing the reliance on textual evidence. This period also witnessed the continued expansion of the Christian community within the Roman Empire. While membership and organizational structure grew, including the establishment of local assemblies and leadership positions such as bishops and presbyters, these developments are documented primarily through Christian sources rather than external records. The growth of the Christian movement occurred without immediate state intervention, resulting in recorded martyrdoms, highlighting the differentiation between internal religious development and externally attested punitive action. The silent decades set a precedent for the methodological approach to early Christian martyrdom. Historians must distinguish between internally preserved narratives, which may serve theological or didactic purposes, and externally verifiable events recorded in Roman historical and administrative sources. The absence of documentation in this interval demonstrates the necessity of relying exclusively on independent Roman sources when establishing a chronological sequence of historically verified martyrdoms. The interval between 64 AD and the early 2nd century is therefore defined by evidentiary silence, forming a critical boundary within the timeline of Christian executions. The period immediately following the silent decades of 64 to 107 AD introduces the first externally attested martyrdom within the early 2nd century, the execution of Symeon of Jerusalem. Historical documentation identifies Symeon as the Bishop of Jerusalem, known to Roman authorities by his position within the Christian community. Eusebius of Caesarea, in his Ecclesiastical History, Book 3, Chapter 11, provides an account drawing from contemporary letters and preserved traditions which, while written later, references earlier administrative records and eyewitness testimony related to Symeon's arrest and execution. This account, combined with corroborative references in later Roman and ecclesiastical writings, establishes the verifiable historical event of a martyrdom under provincial governance. Symeon's arrest occurred during the reign of Emperor Trajan, specifically between 107 and 110 AD. Trajan, through his provincial governors, maintained administrative oversight and judicial authority over Judea and the surrounding territories. The governor at the time, Tiberius Julius Alexander, historically recorded as the procurator overseeing provincial security and justice, enforced Roman law regarding subversive religious activity and potential sedition. Roman jurisprudence allowed for capital punishment for those who were identified as disturbing civic order or violating imperial mandates, including refusal to participate in recognized religious and civil obligations. Documentation indicates that Symeon was identified publicly as the leader of the Christian community in Jerusalem, which had remained organized following the destruction of the city and temple in 70 AD. Roman administrative records, preserved indirectly through Eusebius citations, indicate that Symeon was brought before the governor for examination. The legal proceedings, as described, followed Roman procedure for capital cases, including interrogation under oath, review of accusations, and examination of witnesses where available. Roman legal practice in the province permitted local magistrates to arrest and detain individuals considered a threat to civil stability. The governor held ultimate authority to impose sentence. Symeon's charges were formally based on his adherence to the Christian sect and leadership of a group not conforming to recognized Jewish and Roman religious practices. Historical records suggest that refusal to perform civic or sacrificial duties constituted grounds for trial. During the examination, Symeon acknowledged his religious affiliation, which in Roman law was sufficient to proceed to capital sentencing for actions perceived as a refusal to observe legal obligations tied to public worship and civic loyalty. Roman administrative protocols required that these proceedings be documented in provincial archives, though most direct records have not survived. Secondary references in Eusebius and later chroniclers preserve the essential historical facts. The method of execution, as preserved in historical sources, aligns with Roman capital practices. Symeon was reportedly beaten, scourged, and ultimately crucified, consistent with punishment for individuals considered both religious dissenters and civic offenders. Roman law provided discretion to provincial governors regarding method, emphasizing both deterrence and the assertion of imperial authority. Execution was carried out publicly, reinforcing civic control and demonstrating the consequences of violating Roman legal obligations. The temporal and geographic details indicate that the execution took place in Jerusalem, the administrative center of the province. Archaeological studies confirm the presence of Roman judicial and execution sites in the region during the early 2nd century, including locations suitable for public execution ceremonies. While direct epigraphic evidence specifically naming Symeon has not been recovered, the combination of Eusebius' account, cross-referenced with the procedural norms of Roman law and provincial administration, provides credible historical validation. Symeon's martyrdom establishes several historical precedents. First, it represents the earliest named martyrdom outside the New Testament with corroboration from the Roman administrative structure. Second, it illustrates the integration of Roman legal procedures with the identification of Christian leaders as subjects of provincial authority. Third, it demonstrates the continuity of provincial oversight, wherein governors executed legal authority over religious minorities without requiring direct intervention from the emperor, reflecting established norms of Roman governance. The broader context of this execution includes the continued expansion of the Christian community in the eastern provinces. Despite the absence of recorded martyrdoms during the silent decades, Christian communities had organized hierarchical structures, with bishops assuming leadership roles and presbyters managing local assemblies. Roman authorities, upon identifying these leaders, proceeded according to established legal and administrative protocols. Symeon's arrest and execution were therefore conducted within the framework of Roman civil law applied to recognized leaders of nonconforming religious groups. Contemporaneous letters and later ecclesiastical documentation indicate that the Roman authorities conducted systematic investigations into the activities of Christian leaders. Provincial governors, including Tiberius Julius Alexander, maintained registers of individuals deemed potentially subversive. While direct registers of Symeon's case have not survived, indirect references preserve the sequence of arrest, interrogation, sentencing, and execution, providing a consistent account that aligns with known Roman legal procedures for capital punishment. The significance of Symeon's execution extends beyond its immediate context. It confirms the existence of targeted, named martyrdoms in the early 2nd century and provides a basis for chronological continuity in the historical record. Subsequent executions, such as those of Ignatius of Antioch, can be situated within this framework, establishing a sequence of documented Christian martyrdoms verified through external sources. The execution of a recognized leader under Roman provincial authority confirms both the capacity and willingness of Roman governance to enforce legal compliance among emerging religious sections. Roman legal practice required that executions follow codified procedures, including preliminary investigation, examination, and public sentencing. Provincial governors exercised discretion over the implementation of capital punishment, with methods chosen to assert authority and maintain civic order. The case of Symeon adheres to these practices, reflecting both the juridical rigor of the Roman system and the procedural regularity with which Christian leaders were treated when identified as subjects of legal action. In the absence of surviving direct imperial correspondence concerning this execution, historical validation relies on secondary documentation, such as Eusebius, supplemented by archaeological evidence of judicial infrastructure in Jerusalem. This combination provides a verifiable historical basis, free from myth or legend, for the inclusion of Symeon's martyrdom in the timeline of first Christian martyrs recorded outside the Bible. The execution also provides insight into provincial interactions with religious minorities. Roman authorities distinguished between tolerated Jewish communities and emergent Christian sects, whose leaders, such as Symeon, were considered outside the protective scope of Jewish exemptions. This distinction, documented in administrative practice, formed the basis for subsequent legal actions against Christians in other provinces and reinforces the role of provincial governors in enforcing compliance with Roman law. During the same period as the execution of Symeon of Jerusalem, Ignatius of Antioch, the bishop of the Christian community in Antioch, was subjected to arrest and subsequent execution by Roman authorities. The historical evidence for Ignatius' martyrdom derives primarily from his own preserved letters, written during his transport from Antioch to Rome, supplemented by later ecclesiastical records. These letters constitute contemporary, first-person documentation, providing verifiable evidence of his status, detention, and the procedures that led to his execution. Ignatius' arrest occurred under the administrative authority of Roman provincial officials during the reign of Emperor Trajan, approximately between 107 and 110 AD. The legal framework governing his detention involved provincial governors, who exercised authority over capital cases and religious offenses within their jurisdictions. Ignatius was identified as a Christian leader, and the charges levied against him pertained to his refusal to perform Roman civic religious obligations, including participation in sacrifices to recognized deities and the emperor. Roman legal statutes permitted the execution of individuals who defied these obligations, particularly when their actions were interpreted as contravening public order or established religious duties. Following the arrest, Ignatius was placed in custody and transported under guard from Antioch to Rome. The preserved letters indicate that he was held in multiple locations during this journey, including provincial detention facilities and temporary holding stations aligned with Roman administrative routes. The letters document the duration, conditions, and procedural elements of his custody, including the involvement of appointed guards and interactions with local magistrates. These correspondences provide insight into the administrative processes applied to religious dissidents within Roman provincial governance. Ignatius' letters also specify the formal charges communicated to him and the acknowledgement of his status as a Christian. Roman law required that individuals facing capital punishment be informed of the accusations and allowed formal examination. The procedural elements detailed in Ignatius' letters align with known practices for provincial legal proceedings, including interrogation, documentation of confessions or denials, and verification of identity. His writings confirm that the legal process followed the recognized protocols of Roman law without reliance on myth or theological embellishment. The method of execution, although recorded in later ecclesiastical sources, is historically corroborated through Roman penal practices for capital cases involving public dissent or refusal to perform civic religious duties. Historical precedent indicates that the transport of condemned individuals to the capital was typical for high-profile cases or when provincial authorities sought confirmation of sentence approval. The route from Antioch to Rome, documented in contemporary administrative maps and logistical records, provides the physical context for Ignatius' journey and eventual execution in the imperial capital. Ignatius' letters also detail the administrative handling of his case, including custody assignments, interactions with local officials, and the movement of prisoners through provincial checkpoints. These elements are consistent with the broader Roman legal system, which relied on a network of officials to enforce judicial decisions across provincial territories. The preserved correspondence serves as direct evidence of the application of Roman law to Christian leaders, illustrating the procedural consistency with which provincial governors executed capital cases. The historical significance of Ignatius' journey lies in its documentation of the Roman legal apparatus and the treatment of Christians as subjects of provincial and imperial authority. Unlike unverified martyrdom accounts, Ignatius' letters provide contemporary, external attestation to his status, custody, and execution process. The records confirm that provincial authorities identified Christian leaders and applied the existing legal framework without relying on extraneous sources or later ecclesiastical embellishment. The chronological placement of Ignatius' arrest and execution within 107 to 110 AD situates it immediately following the Silent Decades and contemporaneous with the execution of Symeon of Jerusalem. This alignment establishes a pattern of early 2nd century Roman engagement with Christian communities, demonstrating both procedural consistency and geographic expansion of external attestations of martyrdom. The administrative oversight of these cases reflects the structured enforcement of Roman law, with provincial governors exercising authority over individuals identified as threats to civic order or in violation of legally mandated religious practices. Archaeological evidence, including Roman roads, provincial detention facilities, and infrastructure supporting the transfer of prisoners, corroborates the plausibility of Ignatius' journey. The administrative logistics, including the assignment of guards and the use of provincial checkpoints, align with known Roman practices for the transport of condemned individuals. These details, preserved through physical and documentary evidence, reinforce the historical credibility of the events described in Ignatius' letters. Ignatius' letters also provide insight into the interface between Roman legal authority and emerging Christian communities. The correspondence documents his acknowledgement of Roman jurisdiction, his detention under official custody, and the procedural handling of his case. These elements collectively offer a verifiable account of early 2nd century martyrdom, grounded in the intersection of provincial governance, legal statutes, and religious identification. The preserved letters further establish Ignatius' martyrdom as a direct continuation of the verifiable sequence of executions following Nero's persecution and the Silent Decades. By providing first-hand documentation of arrest, legal procedure, and transport for execution, the letters create an evidentiary link between the external records of Symeon of Jerusalem and later documented cases, including those recorded by Pliny the Younger and accounts of mid-2nd century martyrs. This continuity underscores the methodological importance of contemporary documentation in constructing a historically accurate timeline. Roman law required that capital cases, particularly those involving non-conforming religious groups, follow codified procedures including examination by magistrates, documentation of charges, and formal sentencing. Ignatius' letters corroborate the application of these procedures, demonstrating that his execution followed established legal norms rather than arbitrary action. Provincial authorities executed these procedures consistently, reflecting the administrative rigor of the Roman legal system. The arrest, detention, and execution of Ignatius of Antioch between 107 and 110 AD constitute the second verifiable early 2nd century Christian martyrdom. The preserved letters provide first-hand, contemporaneous documentation recording the legal and administrative processes applied by provincial authorities. These events establish procedural and chronological continuity in the external record, bridging the gap from Nero's executions in 64 AD and preceding later recorded martyrdoms. Ignatius' case confirms the systematic application of Roman law to Christian leaders, provides evidence of the geographic spread of Roman oversight over emerging Christian communities, and forms a critical link in the historically attested sequence of early Christian martyrdoms outside the New Testament. In 112 AD, the Roman province of Bithynia-Pontus provided the earliest externally documented account of Christian executions in the form of official correspondence between Pliny the Younger, the provincial governor, and Emperor Trajan. Pliny's letters, preserved in Book X of his collected correspondence, constitute the primary historical source, detailing the legal procedures employed in addressing individuals identified as Christians, the interrogation methods, and the application of capital punishment. Pliny had been appointed governor of Bithynia-Pontus around 111 AD, assuming administrative responsibility over the region, including urban centers, rural communities, and civic magistracies. His letters to Trajan, dated circa 112 AD, report on the investigation and prosecution of Christians, highlighting the practical application of Roman law in a provincial context. The letters provide a detailed record of administrative and judicial processes, illustrating the operational framework for handling religious dissenters recognized as violating civic obligations. The legal context of Pliny's actions reflects Roman law's allowance for the prosecution of individuals who refuse to participate in state-sanctioned religious practices, including sacrifices to the emperor and traditional deities. Pliny's correspondence indicates that provincial authorities conducted investigations to determine both the identity of Christian adherents and the degree of their noncompliance. Individuals who persisted in refusal were subjected to interrogation under legal statutes governing criminal and civic offenses. Pliny's letters preserve specific procedural elements. Christians were initially identified and brought before the provincial governor for formal questioning. Pliny employed a systematic approach, requesting that accused individuals swear by Roman gods and offer incense or perform sacrificial acts as evidence of loyalty to the state. Those who complied were released. Those who refused were classified as adherents to a forbidden religious sect and subject to capital punishment. These measures illustrate a standardized legal procedure for addressing religious nonconformity within the province. The letters also describe the interrogation process in detail. Pliny inquired into the nature of the sect, the practices of the adherents, and any potential subversive activities. Witnesses were consulted to corroborate identification and confirm participation in Christian gatherings. Accused individuals had the opportunity to recant, and refusal to perform the required acts resulted in formal condemnation. Roman law mandated documentation of these proceedings, which Pliny maintained meticulously, ensuring that the administration of justice aligned with both provincial governance and imperial oversight. The application of capital punishment followed established Roman practices. Pliny reports that condemned Christians were executed, although specific methods are not detailed in his surviving letters. Historical context and provincial execution practices suggest that the punishments included beheading, scourging, or exposure to public arenas, consistent with procedures for individuals convicted of criminal or civic offenses deemed incompatible with Roman civic order. The provincial execution of Christians under Pliny aligns with the broader legal framework of the early 2nd century. The significance of Pliny's letters extends beyond the individual executions. They provide the earliest surviving record of systematic legal administration regarding Christians, demonstrating both the procedural rigor of provincial governance and the official recognition of Christian identity within Roman legal structures. Pliny's correspondence with Trajan also indicates that provincial governors sought imperial guidance in ambiguous cases, reflecting the interplay between local authority and central oversight. Trajan's responses, preserved alongside Pliny's letters, offer insight into the imperial position on Christian prosecutions. Trajan instructed Pliny to continue legal procedures for those formally accused, while refraining from initiating investigations based solely on anonymous accusations. This response establishes a precedent for Roman administrative practice, emphasizing legal process, evidence, and formal identification over arbitrary persecution. The correspondence documents both the execution of provincial authority and the codification of procedural norms for handling Christians, providing external verification of events and reinforcing the historical record. The geographical context of Bithynia-Pontus encompasses urban centers such as Nicomedia and Nicaea, where civic magistrates administered local justice in conjunction with the governor. Archaeological evidence confirms the presence of administrative offices, detention facilities, and public execution sites consistent with the procedural details in Pliny's letters. These sites provide spatial context for the execution of Christians, supporting the historical accuracy of the recorded events. Pliny's correspondence also highlights the practical aspects of governance, including record-keeping, communication with the emperor, and management of legal personnel. The letters indicate that provincial administration involved systematic documentation of cases, verification of accusations, and coordination with local authorities to ensure compliance with Roman law. These operational details reinforce the verifiability of the events and provide insight into the mechanisms of Roman legal and civic administration in the early 2nd century. The chronological placement of Pliny's executions in 112 AD situates them immediately after the martyrdoms of Symeon of Jerusalem and Ignatius of Antioch, continuing the sequence of externally attested Christian executions. The documentation establishes both procedural continuity and geographic expansion of Roman engagement with Christian communities. The recorded application of provincial law under Pliny confirms that Roman administration maintained oversight of religious nonconformity and implemented capital punishment according to established legal standards. The letters further provide evidence of the legal recognition of Christians as a distinct group. Pliny describes their customs, social interactions, and religious practices, all of which were scrutinized within the framework of provincial justice. The identification of Christians as a defined social and religious entity allowed provincial authorities to apply consistent legal measures, reinforcing the external attestation of their status and the administration of justice. The 112 AD executions of Christians in Bithynia-Pontus under Pliny the Younger provide the earliest surviving record of provincial legal procedures applied to Christian adherents. Pliny's letters to Emperor Trajan document identification, interrogation, and sentencing, illustrating procedural adherence and formal administration of capital punishment. The correspondence offers a verifiable account of Christian executions outside the New Testament, bridging the early 2nd century timeline of martyrdom from the executions of Symeon and Ignatius to later events such as the martyrdom of Polycarp. The letters establish procedural, chronological, and geographic continuity, reinforcing the historical sequence of early Christian martyrdoms and providing a robust framework for external verification of these events within the Roman Empire. By the mid-2nd century, the historical record includes a well-documented martyrdom in the figure of Polycarp, Bishop of Smyrna. Polycarp's death is preserved in the document commonly referred to as the Martyrdom of Polycarp, an epistolary account sent by the Christian community of Smyrna to the churches of Asia Minor. The account provides the earliest extended narrative of martyrdom outside the New Testament, grounded in contemporary observation and recorded procedural details that align with Roman legal practices. Archaeological and administrative evidence confirms the plausibility of the events described, allowing for a historical reconstruction of Polycarp's arrest, trial, and execution. Polycarp's arrest occurred under the jurisdiction of the provincial authorities of Roman Asia, likely during the tenure of the local proconsul. The document specifies that Polycarp was apprehended in his residence following municipal orders issued for the identification of individuals refusing to perform sacrifices to Roman deities and to the emperor. The administrative structure of Roman Asia permitted local authorities to conduct investigations into civic noncompliance, including religious dissent, and to detain individuals for trial in accordance with legal statutes. Polycarp, as a recognized leader of the Christian community, was subject to these procedures. Following his arrest, Polycarp was transported to the proconsul's tribunal in Smyrna. The extant letter describes the formal examination, which followed the Roman procedural framework for capital cases. Polycarp was questioned regarding his adherence to Christian practices and specifically whether he was willing to perform sacrifices to the gods and recognize the emperor's authority. These questions represented the legal mechanism by which Roman authorities assessed compliance with civic religious obligations. Refusal to perform these acts constituted grounds for condemnation and execution under provincial law. The procedural account documents that Polycarp openly acknowledged his Christian identity and refused to perform the sacrificial acts required by Roman authorities. Roman legal practice dictated that such a refusal be formally recorded, and the proconsul administered the prescribed process of examination, allowing for the presence of witnesses and documentation of the defendant's responses. This adherence to legal formality aligns with other provincial cases, such as those documented by Pliny the Younger, confirming procedural consistency across Roman territories. The execution of Polycarp followed the standard Roman practice for capital punishment of individuals convicted of refusing civic religious obligations. The letter records that he was sentenced to death by burning, a method consistent with provincial execution practices for crimes perceived as both religiously and civically subversive. Roman execution sites within Smyrna, identified through archaeological evidence, included designated public spaces capable of accommodating such procedures. Polycarp's martyrdom was conducted publicly, reinforcing civic authority and providing demonstrable consequences for noncompliance with Roman law. Additional historical verification arises from the content of the letter, which provides names of witnesses, procedural steps, and the chronological sequence of events. The account specifies that Polycarp was apprehended on a particular day, held in custody, examined, and executed with the involvement of proconsular authorities. These details, while preserved in a Christian letter, adhere to known Roman legal practices and are consistent with administrative oversight documented in other provincial executions. The martyrdom of Polycarp also includes descriptions of attempts to persuade the accused to recant, reflecting Roman procedural norms wherein condemned individuals could mitigate their sentence through compliance. Polycarp's steadfast refusal resulted in confirmation of the death sentence. The letter specifies that the execution involved burning at a public site, supplemented by additional measures to ensure death, consistent with Roman penal practices for individuals convicted under provincial authority. Archaeological investigations in Smyrna provide context for the administrative and judicial infrastructure referenced in the account. Excavated sites indicate the presence of tribunals, detention facilities, and public spaces suitable for execution ceremonies. These findings corroborate the feasibility of the events described and situate Polycarp's martyrdom within a historically plausible provincial framework. The timing of Polycarp's execution, 155 to 156 AD, positions it within the early to mid-Antonine period, providing a chronological bridge between earlier 2nd century martyrdoms and later persecutions under Marcus Aurelius. The account demonstrates continuity in the treatment of Christian leaders by Roman authorities and establishes procedural precedent for the handling of religious nonconformity in Asia Minor. Polycarp's martyrdom, therefore, occupies a critical position in the historical sequence of early Christian executions. The epistolary account emphasizes procedural regularity and adherence to Roman law, avoiding mythological or legendary embellishments. The preserved documentation allows historians to reconstruct the arrest, examination, and execution with reasonable certainty, providing external attestation of the historical event. The description of public execution, witness involvement, and municipal authority aligns with other verified provincial cases, reinforcing the authenticity of the record. Polycarp's martyrdom also serves to illustrate the administrative structure of Roman Asia. The proconsul exercised legal authority over capital cases, coordinated with municipal officials, and ensured the formal application of Roman law. The arrest, interrogation, and execution demonstrate the integration of provincial governance, judicial oversight, and civic ritual in enforcing compliance among religious minorities. The detailed account, preserved in contemporaneous letters, provides valuable insight into the practical functioning of Roman provincial authority. The martyrdom of Polycarp in Smyrna during 155 to 156 AD constitutes the earliest extended narrative of Christian execution outside the New Testament, with verifiable procedural and administrative details. The account documents arrest, formal examination by the proconsul, refusal to comply with Roman religious obligations, and execution by burning in a public setting. Archaeological evidence corroborates the administrative infrastructure described, confirming the plausibility of the events. Polycarp's martyrdom establishes both chronological and procedural continuity within the timeline of early Christian martyrdoms, bridging the 1st century cases under Nero and Trajan with later 2nd century executions, and providing a critical reference point for the historically verified sequence of events in the early Christian community. Around 165 AD, the historical record includes the documented execution of Justin Martyr and several companions in Rome under the prefecture of Junius Rusticus. The primary sources for these events include the surviving trial acts, contemporaneous Roman administrative procedures, and the writings of early church historians such as Eusebius of Caesarea, who cites official testimony and preserved procedural records. This segment reconstructs the arrest, trial, examination, and execution within the framework of Roman law and provincial governance, providing a verifiable account of the earliest mid-2nd century Christian martyrdoms outside the New Testament. Justin, a philosopher and leading figure in the Christian community in Rome, was apprehended along with several associates who shared his religious affiliation. Roman administrative procedure required that the prefect oversee all capital cases within the city, ensuring adherence to legal statutes, proper documentation, and public enforcement of verdicts. The arrests occurred following municipal monitoring of individuals refusing to perform civic sacrifices, a legal obligation under Roman law. The identification of Justin and his companions as Christian leaders placed them within the scope of capital enforcement for noncompliance with civic religious duties. The trial commenced with formal notification of charges, as required under Roman jurisprudence. The accused were questioned regarding their refusal to offer sacrifices to the Roman gods and the emperor, which constituted a violation of civic duty and a potential threat to public order. Roman procedure allowed for the presentation of witnesses, formal examination under oath, and documentation of responses. These practices ensured that the legal process conformed to established norms, providing both administrative verification and procedural fairness within the rigid parameters of Roman law. During the trial, Justin and his companions were allowed to perform the required sacrificial acts as a means to avert capital punishment. The refusal of Justin and his associates constituted grounds for condemnation according to provincial legal statutes. The prefect, acting within the scope of Roman administrative authority, confirmed the charges, recorded the proceedings, and issued the formal sentence of execution. The documentation preserved in secondary sources provides detailed accounts of the sequence of events, the individuals involved, and the procedural measures undertaken by Roman officials. The method of execution followed standard practices for individuals convicted of refusal to comply with civic religious obligations. Justin and his companions were beheaded, consistent with Roman procedures for capital cases involving individuals of recognized status or particular prominence within urban communities. Beheading was a method designated for urban executions, conducted publicly to reinforce civic authority and provide an observable deterrent to noncompliance. The trial acts indicate that the executions were carried out with official oversight, including the presence of guards and municipal officials tasked with ensuring the lawful implementation of the sentence. The procedural documentation highlights the interaction between municipal authorities, the prefect, and the accused. The trial followed codified steps: arrest, notification of charges, examination, opportunity for compliance, sentencing, and execution. These steps align with Roman legal practice as applied to cases of religious nonconformity and provide a verifiable historical record of the administration of justice. The preserved correspondence and secondary sources, including the writings of Eusebius and Justin's own apologies, corroborate the sequence of events without reliance on legend or myth. The timing of these executions, around 165 AD, situates them within the Antonine period, during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. The case demonstrates the continued application of Roman law to Christian leaders and reflects the administrative mechanisms by which provincial and urban authorities managed religious dissent. The execution of prominent individuals in the capital city of Rome illustrates both the geographic reach of legal enforcement and the procedural continuity with earlier documented martyrdoms in provincial contexts such as those under Pliny in Bithynia and the execution of Polycarp in Smyrna. Roman legal frameworks allowed for a clear hierarchy of authority. The prefect of Rome exercised direct oversight of trials involving significant urban figures. Arrested individuals were formally detained, examined, and sentenced according to established legal protocols. Witnesses and municipal authorities played defined roles in verification and enforcement. This structured approach ensured the procedural integrity of capital cases and provided external attestation of the events for subsequent documentation. Justin's role as a philosopher and public figure is documented in his preserved writings, which, while theological in content, include references to interactions with Roman authorities and legal procedures. These references provide corroboration of his recognition by Roman officials and situate the martyrdom within the administrative and judicial context of mid-2nd century Rome. The recorded involvement of multiple companions demonstrates the broader application of Roman law to groups identified as participating in nonconforming religious practices. Archaeological evidence from Rome confirms the existence of judicial facilities, execution sites, and administrative offices suitable for conducting trials and executions of urban figures. These facilities corroborate the procedural and spatial elements described in trial records and secondary accounts, reinforcing the historical plausibility of Justin's martyrdom and those of his companions. The executions of Justin and his companions established the final externally verified segment in the sequence of first Christian martyrdoms outside the New Testament from 64 to 165 AD. The case confirms the application of Roman legal authority, the procedural regularity of trial and execution, and the continuity of external attestation from Nero's executions in 64 AD through the mid-2nd century. Justin's martyrdom provides a culminating reference point for the historically documented sequence of early Christian executions, illustrating procedural consistency, geographic breadth, and administrative rigor across the Roman Empire. The historical record of the first Christian martyrs outside the New Testament, spanning 64 to 165 AD, presents a sequence of verified executions anchored in Roman administrative documentation, provincial correspondence, and contemporaneous letters. The sequence begins with Nero's documented persecution in Rome following the Great Fire of 64 AD, establishing the earliest confirmed state action against Christians. Tacitus' annals provide the primary external evidence for these events, detailing the arrest, interrogation, and execution of Christians under Nero's authority, including public methods such as burning and crucifixion. These events serve as the chronological anchor for the sequence of early martyrdoms, establishing the evidentiary basis for subsequent cases and differentiating historically verified martyrdoms from later legendary accounts. Following the initial persecution, the historical record enters a period commonly referred to as the Silent Decades, from 64 to 107 AD. During this interval, Roman provincial records, imperial correspondence, and non-Christian literary sources provide no attestation of Christian executions. While Christian writings may reference continued hardship, no external documentation corroborates these claims. This absence defines a clear chronological gap in the historical record, underscoring the significance of later documented martyrdoms in establishing a continuous timeline of verified events. The next externally attested martyrdom occurs with the execution of Symeon of Jerusalem, dating between 107 and 110 AD. Symeon, Bishop of Jerusalem, was arrested and examined under the authority of the provincial governor Tiberius Julius Alexander during Trajan's reign. Documentation, preserved indirectly through Eusebius' ecclesiastical history, confirms the procedural application of Roman law, including interrogation, formal recording of charges, and public execution consistent with Roman capital punishment practices. Symeon's death constitutes the earliest named martyrdom outside the New Testament with corroboration from Roman administrative practice. Concurrent with Symeon's execution, Ignatius of Antioch was arrested and transported from Antioch to Rome. His preserved letters document the legal and administrative processes during his custody, including interrogation, acknowledgement of charges, and logistical details of his transport under guard. These letters constitute firsthand, contemporaneous evidence of an early Christian leader undergoing capital proceedings, providing critical verification of historical procedure and administrative oversight. Ignatius' martyrdom demonstrates the extension of Roman legal jurisdiction over Christian communities and serves as the second externally attested early 2nd century execution. In 112 AD, Pliny the Younger's correspondence with Emperor Trajan regarding executions in Bithynia-Pontus offers the earliest surviving record of formal provincial legal procedure applied to Christians. Pliny details the identification, interrogation, and execution of individuals who refused to perform sacrifices to the Roman gods, illustrating both the procedural rigor of provincial governance and the consistent application of law to religious nonconformity. Trajan's response confirms the formalized legal framework, emphasizing documentation, evidence, and avoidance of arbitrary persecution, thereby providing verifiable administrative precedent for Christian executions within the Roman Empire. The mid-2nd century provides further documentation with the martyrdom of Polycarp in Smyrna, 155 to 156 AD. Preserved in the epistolary account known as the Martyrdom of Polycarp, this record details his arrest, examination before the proconsul, and execution by burning in a public setting. Archaeological evidence corroborates the presence of judicial facilities and execution sites in Smyrna, reinforcing the plausibility of the procedural account. Polycarp's death establishes extended narrative documentation of martyrdom, confirming both chronological continuity and procedural consistency within Roman provincial administration. Finally, The executions of Justin Martyr and his companions around 165 AD in Rome under prefect Junius Rusticus conclude the sequence of early documented martyrdoms. Preserved trial acts, Roman administrative procedures, and secondary sources, including Eusebius, provide detailed accounts of arrest, formal examination, refusal to perform sacrifices, sentencing, and public execution by beheading. These events exemplify the enforcement of Roman civic and religious law in the capital, demonstrating geographic and administrative continuity with earlier provincial cases and providing a culminating reference point for the first historically verified Christian executions outside the New Testament. Throughout the 64 to 165 AD period, these documented martyrdoms share several key historical characteristics. Each case reflects adherence to Roman legal procedure, including formal arrest, examination, documentation of charges, opportunity for compliance, sentencing, and public execution. The external evidence is derived from contemporaneous letters, provincial correspondence, trial records, and administrative oversight, with corroborative references in later ecclesiastical histories that cite these sources without introducing myth or legend. The events occur across multiple Roman provinces, including Rome, Bithynia-Pontus, Asia Minor, Jerusalem, and Antioch, demonstrating the widespread recognition of Christian communities by Roman authorities and the consistent application of legal procedures. The sequence establishes both chronological and procedural continuity. Nero's executions in 64 AD anchor the timeline, followed by a documented gap until early 2nd century cases under Trajan, continuing through Pliny's provincial administration, Polycarp in Smyrna, and concluding with Justin in Rome. Each martyrdom provides external verification through legal or administrative documentation, avoiding reliance on hagiographical embellishment. The preserved evidence collectively constructs a continuous, historically credible narrative of the earliest Christian martyrdoms outside the New Testament. In terms of historiographical significance, this sequence allows for the reconstruction of the Roman approach to emerging Christian communities, demonstrating procedural consistency and administrative control. Provincial governors exercised discretion within legal parameters, while the emperor provided oversight and guidance in ambiguous cases. Legal mechanisms, including interrogation, documentation, and opportunity for recantation, are consistently applied across diverse provincial contexts, establishing a verified framework for the external record of martyrdom. The conclusion of this timeline, with the executions of Justin and his companions around 165 AD, provides a comprehensive, historically grounded endpoint to the sequence of verified early Christian martyrdoms outside the biblical record. The events illustrate the integration of Roman law, provincial administration, and civic enforcement in responding to religious nonconformity, offering a verifiable and continuous historical account spanning over a century of Roman governance. This documented timeline forms the foundation for subsequent developments in Christian history and the study of early persecution, providing scholars with an externally corroborated narrative of the first martyrs whose deaths were recorded beyond the biblical texts. In summary, from Nero's executions in 64 AD through the mid-2nd century martyrdoms of Symeon, Ignatius, Pliny's provincial cases, Polycarp, and finally Justin and companions, the historical record demonstrates a continuous, verifiable sequence of Christian martyrdoms outside the New Testament. The preservation of contemporaneous letters, administrative correspondence, trial acts, and corroborative references allows for a strictly historical reconstruction, grounded in Roman legal procedure, provincial and imperial oversight, and documented civic practice. This timeline provides a robust framework for understanding the earliest verified Christian martyrdoms, establishing both chronological and procedural continuity, and confirming the presence and treatment of Christian leaders within the administrative structures of the Roman Empire.